And what we see great musicians do is play something wrong or, inaccurately or something. And rather than going through all of the toiling to turn that into a doable thing, they play it wrong and then they immediately change it into something they can do. So it goes from wrong to right and then right. And then they add a little bit of difficulty and it stays right and right and right and beautiful and right.
Welcome to the Bulletproof Musician Podcast, where you'll learn how to practice more effectively and perform better under pressure with insights from expert musicians and the latest research in performance psychology. So the other day I came across a video of me practicing as a kid that my dad must have captured this when I was maybe 12 or 13 or something. And it was horrifying to watch on multiple levels. I mean, not just because of, the knee-high socks and, the rugby shirt and so forth. And not even because of how bad I sounded. Like that I could tolerate. It was because of how horrendous my approach to practicing was, if you want to even call it practicing. I was just like repeating the same thing over and over and over, clearly not having figured anything out or solved anything meaningfully. I couldn't watch it. Like it felt terrible to see. But I did this for hours and like countless years, and I did get better. And I think we've all been guilty of this at some point or another in our studies. And maybe part of it is that we just rarely get to see advanced musicians or expert musicians practice. Like we see the finished product, which is always amazing, but how they get there is just a mystery to most of us. And so this makes this paper that you recently published with Bob Duke particularly interesting because you took a closer look at what exactly true expert artist level performers actually do in the practice room. This is what I'd love to spend some time exploring with you today. I'd love for you to share some of the key things that you observed that all of us, whether we're in the first few years of studying an instrument or whether we're in our conservatory studies or whether we have years of professional experience, like what are some of the key things that we can take away from your findings?
Well, first, I think you should publish that video. I think not only for the tube socks, but, one of the things that I know, you interviewed Bob Duke, my mentor, years ago now. But, one of the things that he and I have worked hard, and we're both continuing to work hard to sort of dispel, is some of the mystery and the mythology that surrounds practice. And I'm just, because hopefully you keep this in the show, but I just want to thank you for what you've done for our community to help do this, to help sort of take some of the confusion that exists around practice and to infuse it with, what's known about skill development, how it is that humans get better. And there's actually a lot of science about how we get good at stuff. But in the music world, many of us, in many of our learning environments, are still sort of operating on mystery. Young Noah was in the practice room doing a lot of things, just kind of hoping that tomorrow or next week, some of those things will pay off. But, there is not a clear understanding of how or why any of that stuff leads to learning for people that age. First of all, I think it's important to mention that for the experts that we watched, it's a mystery to them too. I mean, we did another project. So with this particular project, we watched a handful of some of the best trumpet players in the world practice. And later on, we actually did another project where we interviewed them about those videos. About a year had passed, so we wanted to put some time so that they had forgotten everything they did. And they're not totally sure what they're doing either. So I don't think it's bad to have a sort of the response that you've had of like, I don't know what I was doing. I don't know what was going on. I think a lot of us have that same response. But one of the things that we sort of get caught up in when we're helping people practice more effectively is we want to teach them how to do things. We want to teach them how to behave in the practice room. And what we're trying to get out in this paper is not necessarily the doing portion, but the thinking portion. That really great musicians, all of us, we're doing the things we do in the world in response to how we think. So in this particular paper, we sort of went into extraordinary detail about what it was that these expert musicians were doing moment to moment. So, sort of what portions of the music they were playing. If they modified a passage, what did they modify it to? How did they modify it? Did they play a smaller portion? Did they slow? Did they reduce the tempo? Did they sort of extract some of the phrase shape from a trial? So we looked at all these doing things, and the reason why we went into such detail about what they did moment to moment is we used those observable behaviors to infer thinking, like what it was they were actually thinking in the practice room. Because it's not a radical thing to think that practicing musicians think that they are the ones making the music in the practice room, because they are. That is one of the roles. Like, they are the ones playing the trumpet. They're the ones singing the phrase. They're the ones playing the violin. That role is important, but it's only one of the roles that I think actually end up, sort of making learning either, accessible or not. And it's not necessarily the doing portion. So there's the doer, the person who's making the music. There is the perceiver. So there's a perceptual role in that. And in our, in the music world, it's hearing and feeling. So we have a perception of the way that we think we sounded and the way that we perceived feeling. And then we have an assessor. We have a part of us that is making sort of a judgment call about the quality of the sound and the feeling that we just experienced. Particularly, is it what we intended or not? And but it's the last role that Bob and I are really hoping to tease out here, and that's the decision maker. The great practicers are essentially answering one really important question over and over and over in the practice room, and that's, based on what just happened, what should I do next? And one of the things that you've talked about a lot on this podcast, and there's a lot of great research that looks at practice behaviors, what are typically referred to as strategies. It's been a big part of practice research over the past couple of decades to look at, how practicers slow things down, how they break difficult or bigger passages into smaller passages, segmenting or chunking, how they use the metronome, whether they sing through stuff, these sort of what are typically referred to as strategies. We actually don't think they're strategies. Those are activities, and they are things that people do, but a strategy is actually a procedure for accomplishing a goal. And those activities in and of themselves do not rise to the level of strategy. They're things people do, but it's the strategy of great practice is what we're trying to get to. Like, why is it that great musicians are doing what they do moment to moment? And it's that decision-making process that we're trying to tease out.
There were a number of elements in the what you and Bob called the central, I might be getting it wrong, the central model for effective practice, or central strategy for, you tell me what it is at some point.
Yeah, the central strategy of music practice.
Yeah. And I wonder if maybe it would be useful to just kind of lay out what those key elements of the strategy are, and then maybe unpack some of those individual elements, because I think when we see the strategy, it makes sense, but the actual doing of the strategy is sometimes easier said than done. So I wonder if you could just kind of lay out for us, to catch everybody up to date on what is this strategy, and what does it look like?
Sure. It's maybe important to say first that, practice is iterative. That what we're referring to as the strategy is essentially an iterative cycle of thinking and doing that leads to improvement. I sort of cringe at the word repetition a little bit. I just moved to New Jersey from Texas, where I was working with Bob Duke for 6 years, and the word, I learned a verb when I was there that I've since been told that it comes from like the competitive marching band world. But they use this verb pretty commonly in band settings. They'll say, okay, here's what it'll be something like, oh, we're going to get this. It's going to be just fine. We just need to rep it. And there's this sort of almost religious belief in the idea of just doing it again will magically make it better. And that's not the case. Anyone who's practiced as much as you and I have in our lives knows that it's entirely possible to repeat something poorly over and over and over again and get it no better. In fact, I've watched enough hours of sort of beginner student level practice, probably a lot like your video, to see that lots of repetition may actually make improvement less likely. There are repetitive features of great practice, but essentially really effective practice is iterative in that it changes slightly every time you do it. So the strategy that we outline is really about these different iterations of things as we look to progress through difficult passages. So there's a sort of first step and it goes to the end, but it's not as if that's the beginning of practice. It's like getting on a moving train. This is a cycle that's constantly happening during practice. We're just sort of making it seem as if it's a discrete thing. It's not really that cut and dry. The first feature is that great practicers formulate a vivid intention or prediction for each trial. And what that means, and this sort of hits a little bit on Edwin Gordon's idea of audiation, but it's essentially how vivid is your idea of the thing that you're aiming for. You've had lots of talks with people about goals, and what we know generally about human behavior is that if you have a really fuzzy goal, your brain's going to come up with a really fuzzy solution. But if you have a really clear idea of how you want something to sound and feel, the activities, the behaviors, the thoughts that you generate to reach that goal are much more likely to get you where you're trying to get. So great musicians formulate a vivid intention. They perform the trial, which, hopefully that's pretty obvious, but there does need to be some kind of doing for optimal practice. They identify discrepancies quickly. And this is a place where I had to sort of get out of my music brain for a little bit, because I think a lot of great musicians who practice would say, well, of course we do. Of course we recognize when we miss a note, or when we frack something or play a B flat instead of a B natural. But one of the things that we sort of tried to tease out a bit was how magical it is that great musicians can stop when they hear things that don't go the way they want them to, because what that means is that the thing they're hearing doesn't align with how they intended to hear it, which means that they must have an idea of how they were intending for that to sound and feel. So the idea of an error, even really subtle errors in great practice, is kind of an incredible thing to dive into. So they identify discrepancies quickly. They pause to think. And I think probably in your practice video is something that I've seen a lot in string players and guitar players are really, this is an interesting thing here, where they just sort of do a thing over and over and over again. And sometimes like the last note of one attempt becomes the first note in the next attempt. Like there's literally no time between one attempt and another attempt. But what we find, at least in these trumpet players, and that's who I watch with trumpet players, is they take time to think, presumably about what just happened and plan what to do next. And then the sort of bulk of what we were looking at with great practicers is the sort of final step, which is that they strategically repeat passages to minimize prediction errors. And there are sort of three big ways that they do that. And the first is that they doabilize. They adjust the parameters, and I'm reading this here, so it's off the paper. So they adjust the parameters of each succeeding performance trial to render momentary challenges surmountable in the near term. Now, all we mean by that is that when great practicers do something that goes wrong, what they don't do is that same thing again. They won't simply just try it again, or they might try it again once. But when they play something that doesn't go the way they intended to, they immediately modify that so that it becomes a doable portion of that, or a doable version of that. And that's why we use the term doabilize, because they essentially immediately turn an undoable passage, something that they can't currently play they can't currently play the way they want to. They immediately modify it into something they can. And I'm going to come back to that in a bit, because that's the thrust of the paper is there. They maintain contextual elements to the extent that's possible. And by that, all we mean is that what great musicians probably don't do very often. We didn't see a single instance of it in our data, but my guess is it's very rare. They don't simply go back and work on, like if they're struggling with something in a sort of a D major passage, they don't go work on the D major scale. They don't decontextualize that individual passage any more than they have to in order to play it beautifully. And then the final step is they recontextualize strategically in ways that maintain a high percentage of successful trials. And all we mean there is that once they doabilize a passage and they make it something they can do beautifully and accurately, they don't just then plunk it into the entire piece. Now that they've got something that they can play beautifully, they add difficulty in ways that maintain beautiful, accurate playing. So those are the big features of it. And there are a few things in there I can dig into with a little more detail if that's appropriate.
Yeah, and I want to spend a healthy amount of time on the doabilizing portion and the contextualization parts of that, because that was one of the main things I wanted to expand on. But yeah, maybe it makes sense to kind of go through the elements, taking a little bit of time in each of them, because these are questions that often come up when I talk to other musicians or teachers, and I'd love to get your take on some of these. So for instance, the first step of formulating a vivid intention or prediction for each trial. I mean, this resonates with something even in psychology that my advisor was fond of saying, which is that, if you misdiagnose the problem, you're probably going to misdiagnose the solution. And so we spent a lot of time really digging into like problem definitions, like what is actually the problem here? Because a lot of times our initial guess as to what the problem was, not actually what the problem was. And so we would look for solutions in the wrong places and kind of be chasing our tail in circles. And what you said reminded me of something I remember Leon Fleischer, the great pianist, saying, which is, I had a coaching with him years ago when I was in this piano trio as a kid. And we were really struggling to describe to him what our goal character-wise for passage was. Like we had very like generic terms like cheerful or upbeat, and he was really looking for much more than that, to like really paint him a picture in words of what we were going for, and we just couldn't. We're like 18 or 19 or something like that. And so at some point he just said, if you can't describe in words, like verbally articulate what you're going for, it's probably because your idea of it or your concept isn't very clear. We had been playing our instruments since we were like 2 or 3 or 5, like a long time we'd been at it, yet still we didn't seem to be able to conceive of what it is that we wanted from this particular passage. One of the questions I've got recently was, how do you help younger students have clear concepts of what they're going for? But even for, older students or more advanced students, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or insights on how to help us with the conceiving part at various stages of development, perhaps.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's what I was thinking I could do, is sort of go through each step of this that we identified with some kind of suggestion as to how it should modify our practice. And this first one is tricky because it's very difficult to get to the bottom of what our students are actually envisioning. As you and Bob talked about, there are different kinds of memory, and we do have declarative memory, the kinds that are associated with language that we can actually put words to. But then we have procedural memories, which are memories for how to do things. And those are not always easy to describe. It's why we can't really describe how we balance on a bike, or how a trombone player can describe how they play a 2-octave chromatic scale. It's just like, how do you put words to that? So it can be difficult for teachers to get to the bottom of like, what are these students really thinking? But we do know that, just like you said, that having that clear goal is clearly advantageous for learning. I mean, one of the studies that came out of the Center for Music Learning, where I used to work with Bob, was done by Lonnie Hamilton. And he talked about this, but just to sort of review, that what she found was that artist level musicians and high school musicians all make what they would consider to be errors at about the same rate when they practice. And that the big difference between those two groups of humans is what counts as an error. And for artist level musicians, having an F sharp with just not the right direction counts as an error. But for a middle school or a high school student, it may just be like, I don't know, I played an up bow instead of a down bow, right? Okay. So one of the more compelling stories of how people get really great at stuff is the evolution of the clarity of what they're intending to do, both on a global scale, but also on a micro scale, on a moment-to-moment scale. So, it's pretty common in sort of masterclass settings and studio settings for teachers to encourage students to listen to music with more detail and more focus and more attention, because we want to get a global idea of how you want to sound on your instrument or your voice. And that's lovely. But I think where there's a lot of room to improve, both from the teaching and the sort of actual music practice perspectives, is not necessarily can individuals imagine a really vivid way of how they want to sound and feel, but are they every moment of their practice? And one of the biggest things that I've tried to help, especially my young students, I love working, I have a couple of middle school students and a couple of high school students that I take on primarily so that I can workshop some of these things with younger learners, because college students are, they're great. I love them. They're almost fully formed humans with fully formed brains. And so you can adjust their behaviors in all sorts of different ways. You can shape their behaviors. But getting middle school students and high school students to think like this is a particular challenge, and I love it. But it's just to put an extra moment of thought before every trial, 3 to 5 seconds. Essentially what we're trying to do is build the habit of, before you do something, are you thinking really carefully about the way you want it to sound? Because one of the things we're trying to do is not just build habits of behavior, but habits of thought. What we want our learners to do is to think in a way that is most likely to elicit great learning. So just even simply taking the opportunity every time, between every trial, take 2-3 seconds and think, how do I really want this to sound? Because what we want them to do is to practice conjuring that aural image. That's the practice at that point. It's not the doing portion. It's not getting your motor system to execute things in different ways. You're practicing conjuring an image of the way you want it to sound and feel. So just building that as a habit into your practice. What we know is that great musicians do this so beautifully and so consistently that they don't even know they do it. This is one of the things that the great musicians that I watch practice and I interview, they often don't have a great understanding of what they're doing, but we know they have a very clear idea of what they're intending to sound like, because they end up sounding like that. You don't stumble into sounding as good as Billy Hunter does, the principal trumpet player in the Met. You don't just accidentally wake up and are that good. I guess my concrete advice is try to build in moments, just small moments, before every single trial, and think as clearly as you can, how do I really want this to sound and feel?
That feels like it connects really nicely to, skipping over the actual doing step and the performing step to the identifying of discrepancies quickly element, which I think, if I remember correctly in your paper, you said, that's sort of an indicator of there having been a clear concept in the first place, because if there wasn't, they wouldn't necessarily have stopped, but immediately recognizing this discrepancy, which I imagine might also be easier said than done. For various reasons. Maybe you could just say more about the sorts of things that you observed or that came to mind when you saw how quickly they stopped upon recognizing something that in their minds was a deviation from what they wanted, or I guess you could call an error.
Yeah, one of the things that I'm always looking to do with learners across the ability spectrum is to embrace the role of error. I think too many of us are raised in musical environments where errors are thought to be things to eradicate, And my middle school band director, who was amazing, hugely influential in not only my life, but hundreds of other people's lives. I'm not even going to name her because I'm about to say something that's not particularly flattering. But we would do these chair tests in middle school, and essentially she would pick like a hard part of the music, and if you wanted to move up a chair in the band, you would play it in front of the band, and then the person in front of you would play it in front of the band, and whoever made fewer errors would get the chair. And I don't think that's not really how a lot of things are done these days, but it's not far from, I think, a lot of things. And what young learners, I think, tend to take from that is that the goal of practice is to make fewer mistakes. And, it is important to say that the goals of performance and the goals of great practice are different. When we're performing in real time, what we're trying to do is sort of conjure all of our capacities to express and play accurately and beautifully in that moment. But great practice is a measure of change. It can't be judged by how amazing you sound in one particular attempt. The sort of value of practice is better judged by the change that happens from attempt to attempt. And the primary mechanism for that change happening is noticing an error or perceiving an error. And the way that I say it to some students is that really great error should be slightly surprising and slightly dissatisfying. That if you're expecting an error to happen, then you're already choosing a task that's too difficult. Like if that's not really going to be hugely beneficial for your learning. So it should be slightly surprising. It should be something that you didn't necessarily expect. And then it should only be slightly dissatisfying. It shouldn't be, catastrophic. Like I remember practicing in dance studios at Juilliard in my undergrad and having difficulty with a thing over and over and over again. And it got so crushing that I was like, weeping and shaking with frustration. And I just had no one to help me understand that that's not how any of this should work. Because what ends up happening to any learner that's experiencing that is their brain is pairing, it's associating all of that practice with all of that negative emotion. And I have spent the better part of 20 years trying to unpair those things. But errors should arise in practice. I think one of the questions I get from students a lot is how much error. And it's a difficult thing to quantify, not only because music is an incredibly complex task and figuring out what's a discrete error is kind of a fool's game at this point. Maybe there will be AI, revelations in the next few years, but for right now, that's a complex problem. But one of the things that I want my students to try to do is to manage the amount of error that comes down for however it is that they're perceiving and conceptualizing error. That what many of my students that aren't artist level musicians, they are doing things that are far too errorful. It's essentially like error triage, that there's so many things going wrong, it's really hard to know what to do about it. So one of the most effective ways to begin to design your practice so that you can get the most out of it is to essentially design things where only a little bit of it goes wrong. And here I like to mention a couple of studies outside of the music world. There's one by Eastman and colleagues that I can share with you, but they had a big old data set from the video game world. And they found that motor acuity, essentially how well we change our motor behaviors over time, motor acuity seemed to improve the fastest when people had an error rate of about 15%. And they, which sort of aligns with what I think a lot of us intuitively feel when we do things, that if we're doing things and 100% of it's going wrong, we're probably not getting better very quickly. And if we're doing things and 100% of it's right, we're also probably not getting better very quickly. But if we're doing stuff that mostly goes just as we think it should, as we expect it to, then what it allows us to do is pay really close attention to the little bit that's not. And that attention and our ability to address that small bit of error is sort of a magical power in our ability to change what we do the next time we try the thing.
I think there are two aspects of that are really fascinating to me. One, and they're kind of on two sides of a continuum maybe. Part of it is the, I think some have called it the zone of proximal development, like making errors that are just slightly outside of what we're capable of at that moment, mm-hmm. and making sure it's not, like you said, a dozen different things are going wrong and we don't even know what to make of it all. The other part of it being too, though, and this looking back at the different steps of your change model that I'm liking more as I look at it is I don't think that you mentioned the word error in it. That step 3, it's identify discrepancies quickly, right? So discrepancies is simply a mismatch between what your goal or expectations were and what ended up happening. And then I say this because I don't think it's just semantics, but I think our concept of what an error is, like you mentioned in the previous study with your colleague at Texas, I think when we're younger, our concept of what an error is very limited and small relative to what an error could be conceptualized as. And I think often it's just, did we play it in time, the right notes with a good sound in tune? And this sort of aiming for not making an error, but defined only by those like 3 or 4 factors leads to a very unsatisfying performance experience, but also a very unsatisfying listening and non-compelling listening experience for the audience. And if that's it, we could spend I spent decades where that was essentially my entire aim. And only, as I got older, realized that there's a whole other world, much more meaningful, that I just wasn't spending very much time focused on, which then limited the flexibility and development of the motor skills that were necessary to actually be able to play in that more compelling way, which is sort of my way of going into this aspect of the doabilizing that was a core part of the paper. And I wonder if you could, first off, just kind of remind everyone listening, like, what does it mean to doabilize a passage? And then I want to dig into like what that actually looks like and how to avoid decontextualizing it too much, because the other word that came up a lot was the word context, and I want to make sure that we really understand what that means and what that looks like.
Yes. So doabilizing is essentially the immediate modification of a problematic passage into something that is playable. And by playable, I mean, we're a little squishy with this language, because what counts as an accurate, beautiful trial is going to depend wildly on where you are in the skill spectrum. I mean, there's all sorts of individual variables that are going to sort of modulate how you are thinking about this in your practice. Well, first, let me say why we expected to find this. We looked for it, but we expected to find this primarily based on some research that Bob Duke and Amy Simmons did, I think 2009, where they gave a bunch of pianists some really hard music, and they recorded their practice, and then they had them perform at the end of those practice sessions. And what they found were that the best pianists, the people that learned the most in this study, didn't just play the most notes. They didn't have the highest number of performance trials, which in our world is just an attempt. So it wasn't the number of things that somebody did in a practice session or practice sessions that determined the amount of learning. It was the number of accurate, beautiful trials, the percentage of accurate, beautiful trials. So what they found was that the people who learned the most did the most beautiful, accurate stuff. In other words, they made that their habit. And so this all comes back to habit formation, that when I watch young learners practice, sometimes they'll do something that elicits a lot of error. So there's not good sounds, the rhythm's weird, they frack a couple notes, they're clearly not comfortable with it. What young learners will tend to do is play that, and I'm going to use the term, I'm going to just say wrong and right here, but I don't mean that they played what was on the page. I mean, they played what they intended to play. So they do it sort of wrong, and they know they missed a lot of stuff. And then they'll do it wrong again, and they'll maybe repeat that again. And then they'll start to play a smaller bit, and they'll make it a little bit smaller, or they'll take the tempo down just a little bit. It's still wrong. And then they sort of try another thing, and then it's still wrong, until they get to a doable version of that. And then they play it beautifully and accurately. And so in that scenario, what they end up doing is playing about 10 to 15 inaccurate, sort of not beautiful trials, and that plays a huge role in their habit formation, because that is now their habit to play that badly. And what we see great musicians do is play something wrong or inaccurately or something. And rather than going through all of the toiling to turn that into a doable thing, they play it wrong, and then they immediately change it into something they can do. So it goes from wrong to right, and then right. And then they add a little bit of difficulty, and it stays right and right and right and beautiful and right. And they'll have small deviations from that. But that sort of format of the sort of beautiful, accurate trials versus inaccurate, sort of not expressive, not good trials, that's what we would expect for people that are really good at music, is they are really good at making it their habit to play things beautifully and accurately. So one of the things that I think students struggle with is the immediacy of the doubleizing, that it will take them many moments and many trials to get to a doable version. So one of the suggestions I'll make to my students is to doubleize it more than they think they should. And this is sort of the realm where the strategy use comes in, that like they're not always sure what to do, how to make it doable. Do they slow it down? Should they play a smaller passage? And these are all great questions, but my take on it is that the method of doubleizing is less important than the amount of doubleizing. So whether you slow down or play a smaller passage is not, it's dependent on the what you're actually struggling with. The important thing that I want my younger students especially to get better at is doubleizing enough. Go back far enough in your learning sequence so that you're starting from a place of strength, reliability, consistency, beauty, expression, and then build from there. And that can be very, very hard. I mean, that gets to the decision-making process that we'll talk about in a little bit. But so the thing that I would suggest, if you're looking to sort of maximize your ability to form better habits, and not just practice habits, but performance habits, habits of behavior, is to, when you perceive a discrepancy between the way you intended to play and the way you actually played, think about that for a second, and then really try to make the next thing you play, the next thing. I don't mean like a minute later, 5 minutes later. I mean the next thing you play. Aim to make that something that you can play beautifully, accurately, and expressively. And this, for younger learners and people that are still sort of early in skill development, is going to feel very, very hard. Very few of the people that I work with at sort of college level and younger can do this well. It always feels like they're doing something too small. They're doing it too slowly. It feels like not a difficult enough task. That's the feedback I get from students. But what I try to help them understand a little better is that in order to play this entire movement of a sonata beautifully, you've got to play these two notes beautifully. Those two notes aren't going to magically get more beautiful if you haven't given them the focused attention they need. So if you play a phrase and most of it doesn't go the way you want it to, play two notes. Get those two notes really, really beautiful. It'll take a moment or two, and then start adding some notes, add some tempo, add shape, add, a metronome, whatever it is, however it is that you're adding complexity. Do it in a way that starts from a place of strength, reliability, consistency.
I was going to say, yeah, I imagine it's not so easy to know how to make something doable. A couple of things. I mean, one, I saw you catch yourself that it wasn't the number of correct repetitions, right? The percentage, which right. I think is an important distinction that we have to remember. Like, we're trying to increase the ratio of this beautiful, correct, if you will, repetitions relative to right. the discrepancy ones. In your experience, has it been largely a matter of experience and just learning how to calibrate, or knowing yourself better and knowing what's difficult for you, knowing what you're capable of? I mean, is that a big part of it? Like, does that even take practice, perhaps, to get better at knowing how far back to take it to doubleize?
Yeah. I mean, what we see in the experts is that they sort of do this amazing thing where they don't doubleize it any further than they need to. It's not like they go back to playing long tones or just sort of work on their bow hand, because that would be a waste of time. These are incredibly busy humans that only have 45 minutes or an hour a day to learn the music that they got to play. So the way that they've optimized that is they sort of have this really sweet spot that they hit where they don't doubleize any more than they need to, but it's just enough so that they're not making a lot of errors. And yeah, that is absolutely a skill to be learned. I mean, that's the thing that I'm so thankful for you for, is that we can start thinking and talking as musicians about practice as a skill. It's not just that we're improving our performance, we're improving our practice. We're changing the trajectory of our learning by doing things like this. So yeah, there's a lot for musicians at every ability level to think about here. One of the key factors in this is that practice should be primarily characterized by curiosity. it's data collection. It is one of the reasons why we referred to mistakes and errors, why we sort of left those off of the end framework, that we called them discrepancies, because I think there is a lot of baggage. There's a lot of weight that we assign to errors and mistakes, and we have a lot of guilt and shame. And that from a behavioral perspective, it's just a discrepancy. And when something comes up, you go, huh. I'll tell a quick Bob story, because he's Bob Duke. I had the great pleasure of doing some eye tracking research with him and in the lab down there when I was doing a PhD. And we had these really cool glasses with really amazing software, but doing these two things together brought up a lot of error. So we had these huge data sets of where people were looking in the world and for how long. And there was a time where there were 3 PhD students. They were really big brains, right? Lorelei Batislaung, Laura Hicken, and Robin Heinzen, 3 of my absolute heroes that I was working with at UT, and then Bob. And we were going through these data sets, and we were just getting error after error after error, and nobody could figure out where this was coming from. And this is about a couple of hours went by. And every time we tried something and it didn't work, I got more frustrated. Like my blood pressure went up a little bit, and I turned a little redder and was a little more angry. But Bob had a different response. Every time something went wrong, that didn't go the way we wanted it to, there was no solution. Every time that happened, Bob just goes, huh, I wonder what happened if we tried this. And I got peeved at him, because I was like, it made me even angrier that he was so calm and collected during this whole thing. But I went home and had to decompress a little bit. And then it just occurred to me that oh, that's how really smart people think. That's the way they approach errors. It's that happened. Okay, now we're one step closer to getting the thing we want. But I think when we're hoping as musicians ourselves or teaching students to do this, there is not a right way to teach them how to doabilize. But we need to have an exploration of essentially I'll talk you through what I do with one of my middle school students who he can do this on his own at this point, where he'll play something and all I have to say is, how did that go? And he'd say, that F wasn't kind of what I wanted. And I was like, okay, well, what's your move now? And he'll say, well, let me try this part here because I know I can do that. And I was like, great, how many times are you going to play that? He goes, a few. Well, let me get it how I want it to a few times in a row. And then so he'll do that for a few times in a row. And I'll go, okay, great, that sounds really lovely. What are you going to add to that next that's sort of going to get you to where you want to go? And he'll say, let me try adding this D and the E. I was like, great, try that. And it's just essentially we're toiling. As long as we start from a place where he can make music beautifully, then we sort of begin to have experiences that allow him to connect what he's doing and the decision he's making with the relative success of that decision. And that's what the best practitioners I know, that's what they do. They have that decision-making process. So it's so present in every moment of their practice. And it's undeniably responsible for their artistry and their expertise.
I love the way that you frame that. And you've probably been saying this all along, and I'm just now kind of hearing it this way. But this description of an additive process where we're adding tiny challenges that we're curious to see, can we do this? And can we enhance this passage in this way? That feels much more satisfying and funner than the let me keep playing this until it doesn't suck anymore kind of framework that I observed in myself back then. And, constantly hearing something that we're not happy with and waiting for it to suddenly magically somehow sound better or not displeasing. But that just sounds like so much more engaging and fun than, I think how we naturally gravitate towards.
Well, so I'm from Florida originally. Sorry to interrupt, but I'm from Florida, and we had to learn to swim when we were really young because it's Florida. It's Central Florida. There's sort of lakes everywhere. So we took swimming lessons when I was 4 or 5. And I remember the swimming teacher in the pool, she was right next to the edge. And I would sort of hop in, and then she would say, swim to me. And then she would only be a few feet away from me, and then I'd swim back to the edge. And she would keep swimming backwards as we would do this. And I remember knowing that. I was like, look, I see you. You're swimming back. Just stay where you are. Let me do that thing. But, that's essentially what we're trying to do for our own faculties, is we're trying to essentially, I talk about it as we enter the practice room with this sort of blob of stuff that we can do really well. And that blob is always sort of jostling a little bit and changes from moment to moment and day to day. But our job at any practice session is to take that blob and sort of do some stuff with it so that at the end of that practice session, we can do that and just a sliver more. And if that can be every practice session of your life where you take that stuff and just expand it a little bit, one little thing, a couple of notes, one thing, and that ends up having the capacity over decades of practice to have huge downstream effects in your ability to express yourself on your instrument beautifully and accurately.
The other thing that I wanted to just kind of make a note of is, if this episode, I'm not encouraging this, but if this episode were a drinking game and, you took a sip every time you said the word beautiful or beautifully, I didn't count, but it's a number of occurrences. And I just wanted to highlight that because that is something I remember Bob talking about that always, often as well. And this goes back to this idea of defining error. I think he even said in this episode something about how, a note without inflection is a wrong note, essentially. Yeah. And that's something that I think when we're younger, we don't really think in those terms because we're just, again, focused on the kind of bare basics of correct note, pitch, time, etc. And your story of curiosity and so forth also kind of reminded me of a mentor of mine, and his name is Neil Newman. His whole philosophy that he kind of tried to convey to us was for us to approach life itself more as an experiment and less as a test or exam. And, he really conveyed that to his athletes as well. But that's what this sounds like and feels like to me when you describe it. So I'm trying to tie multiple things together, I suppose, here to dive further into the dualizing. But I'm also reminded again of something Fleischer said, which was that it's easy to play a note. It's much harder to play that note expressively. And along with the word beautiful, a little bit ago, you used the word, to define expectations for a phrase, beautiful and expressive. And I wonder if you can say more about the importance of that part of it in the learning process, and also maybe especially as it relates to the dualizing process and making sure to include that as part of it and why that's so important.
I was talking to someone the other day about, well, actually with some friends of mine, we were presenting down in Florida to the music education conference down there. And one of the things that Bob really does a good job of getting us to think hard about is the importance of expressivity. And one of the ways that we can think about it is that, when we practice or we teach, we have all these what seem like discrete goals for ourselves or our students. And we want them to play with good tone and good time, and we want them to be in the right key signature, and we want them to have the dynamics. And we have all these things that seem like discrete units. And in some ways, like beginner method books do us all a disservice because they try to sequence things in ways that make it possible for us to build on what we knew last week. Like, now you're ready to play A, and they're like, here's the finger for A, and then everybody in the band plays an A. But when they sort of begin to introduce musical elements bit by bit, I think what it ends up, I don't know, the sort of picture that a lot of young learners, I think, end up with is this sort of Mr. Potato Head version of how music's supposed to go. That music really makes sense when you have like the right lips and the right nose and the right eyebrows and the ears. And so they just sort of put all these different pieces together and hope that it is the thing that the teacher would refer to as music. But what we know to be true is that if the goal is playing with expressive inflection, every bit of discrete music making is included in that. You got to play with good time. You have to play with good tone. You have to play in tune with the people around you. And so when we sort of break things down into these discrete units, I think some of the wholeness gets lost. Like one of the ways. I might get too off topic here, and if you need to edit this out, please do. But I think in the brass world, so I'm a trumpet player. I teach at Montclair State University. But I think brass players fetishize fundamentals more than any other group of musicians. I think. If someone disagrees with me, I would love to hear it. But, we sort of will do mouthpiece buzzing for hours a day. We'll do breathing bags and these sort of breathing exercises. And if I'm talking to a student about this, here's what I'll do. I don't know if you can see this. I'll try to do this thing and I'll talk about it. I'll sort of back away and I'll swing my leg back and forth, making a kicking motion. And I'll do that a few times over and over again. And then I'll ask the person I'm working with, I'll say, did I just get better at soccer? And if so, why? If not, why not? And usually with a small discussion, I can get them to admit that I probably didn't get better at soccer. Although kicking is a fundamental part of playing soccer well, just simply swinging your leg back and forth probably isn't getting you better at soccer because there's not a ball. And importantly, there's not the perceptual feedback of where the ball goes when you're doing that swinging of the leg thing. And if you really wanted to make it useful, you might even have a human that you're trying to kick the ball to, maybe a goal, and maybe even a defense person. The big takeaway there is that the further away you get from the actual task, the weirder it gets just to practice that one thing. It just has the disconnect between the final goal and the thing you're actually working on is way too wide. And I think a lot of us, when we think about practicing, we're decontextualizing in ways that don't actually serve the expressive inflection. So one of the things that we talk about in this paper a lot is how much context that great musicians keep, and particularly the expressive inflection. That what we didn't see once in all of the there were not thousands of trials in this study. There were just hundreds, but there were hundreds of performance trials. We didn't see anybody do anything without expressive inflection. And to us, in this particular study, that suggests that playing expressively and beautifully is foundational to what artists, musicians are doing in the practice room. It is not the case that they get all these mechanics worked out and then they plunk art on top of that. That's not at all what they're doing. The way that they're formulating their behaviors and their thoughts is in response to an expressive intent. That the skills that they develop are because of how they want the music to sound in its entirety, not with the right lips and the right nose and the right eyebrows. It's the whole thing that they're responding to. And it's the whole thing that's guiding their moment-to-moment behaviors and iterations that allow them to change their motor behavior over time.
I don't know that you would have someone listening, think this or argue this, but if someone were to hear that and say, well, these are artist level performers who have earned the right to play musically, what would you say to them to kind of disabuse them of this idea that they have been able to do this because they have gotten to the point where they can do that, and that is not something that beginners are capable of or allowed to explore at that stage?
Yeah, I hopefully nobody is thinking that, but if they are, I have some videos to show them of young people playing music expressively. I'm thinking of there's a teacher outside of Austin. Her name is Jennifer Bergeron. She teaches at Walsh Middle School, and she teaches the way that I think Bob would teach middle school band. That expression is first. And the sequence of lessons that emerge from that program are because of an expressive intent. And those kids make beautiful music. And more than that, they enjoy it. And I think I've been doing some work recently with one of my colleagues at Baylor University. I don't work at Baylor. He's at Baylor. Whiff Rudd is his name. He's a trumpet player. That is a fantastic name, Whiff Rudd. And we're curious about how much joy is situated in our learning and in our teaching scenarios. And one of the takeaways from our work right now is that joy is foundational to what we do. And I think practicers at every level, students at every level, deserve to enjoy what they're doing more. They deserve a healthier relationship with skill development. And learning to play music expressively, beautifully with others is an incredibly rewarding and reinforcing activity. And if the highest bar you're setting for yourself or your young students is to play music correctly, you're essentially neutering them from one of the most important human experiences that we can conjure to make beautiful things. So I think there's a sort of an unimaginable disservice done by allowing young people to think that music is just the real estate of the artists. That we toil down in technique and mechanics land, and only once you've done that can you be at a conservatory where you are allowed to make beautiful things. It's no. Go watch young kids make music beautifully and watch their joy, and there should be a lot more of that. And so, like, putting expression first and leaving it sort of in the middle of practice at every stage of learning, I think benefits individuals, but more importantly, it benefits our community of musicians and artists and aspiring artists and researchers and teachers and everybody. So I would respectfully ask that person get some more data about how much kids enjoy playing music expressively, and let's center into that.
I cannot imagine a better place to end the session, but do you have a minute? I mean, can I go beyond a little bit?
Yeah, please.
So I'm going to risk that perfect ending by asking just one last question that I didn't add earlier, and that's about consistency. So once you've gotten to a point where, and you may already have kind of spoken to this in the process of this episode, but once you've gotten to a point where you've doabilized a passage, you've built it back up to add more of the context in of the different elements of expression and challenge and difficulty to really get it to where you want it to be. How do you then ensure that you're able to produce some version of that with some degree of consistency, especially in performance situations where things may change or feel different? Like, what does that process look like?
Well, one of the things that especially my more advanced students, I try to get them to think a lot about is that the goal of great practice is to go all the way from I can't play this the way I want to, and then we get to I can play this the way I want to. But that's only half of it. The other half is from I can play this the way I want to that's the way I play it every single time I play. And what I see a lot of young practicers doing is going from I can't to I can. And I'm sure there's some research about this, but I don't know why this seems to be such a common thing in music practice, is that students will like sort of toil and it'll go sort of bad, good. And then they'll do one that they really are happy with. And I think it cues something in the brain that says like, oh, I got it. No, you don't. You don't got it. What you got in that scenario was a whole bunch of wrongs and one right. For the musicians that we watched, they did not do this thing that we actually encourage young students to do. And I have a reason why we think they don't. But for young students that, sort of toil and modify, and then they get something that does go the way they want it to, the first move should be to do it again. Make it happen again. Make it happen that beautiful twice in a row. That it's not enough to just get it once. And I know I've had some interesting discussion with improvisers and jazz musicians about this particular thing, and that's maybe a different talk. But I'm assuming that most of your listeners are from the sort of Western classical tradition, and the goal is that we want consistency, we want reproducibility in a range. It's not as if, and you've talked about this far more eloquently than I can, but what we're not aiming to do is repeat movements over and over again. We're aiming to repeat outcomes, expressive outcomes. We want to under lots of different scenarios. So after you sort of work on something and toil and get something great, do it again. And what almost everyone is going to be shocked by is not only that you're highly unlikely to be able to do it again immediately, that you'll see when you start paying attention to the percentages, your success rate. When you try that 20 times, how many of them go really, really beautifully? And what that ends up engendering is a really advantageous attention to very small differences from trial to trial. And that perception of discrepancies, to go back to that, is what allows us not only to notice errors, but to do enough of healthy iteration, so that most of what you're doing is exactly the way you intend for it to be. So all that to say, the concrete suggestion is when you play something beautifully, especially after having done a couple of trials where it's not gone the way you want it to, aim to do it again. And really, one of the things that, well, Bob and I have talked a lot about is the idea of having clear, observable goals. This is a big part of his program down at UT, is that we help teachers and students conceptualize clear, observable goals for the thing that you're aiming to do. And one of the ways that I try to do that with my students is to say, you'll know that you'll be done with this when you can play this 5 times in a row, beautifully, accurately, exactly as you intend to play it. And that seems like a crazy number to them, because they're like, well, they'll do 4, and then the 5th one they sort of botch. And it's like, nope, try again, start again. But what we're trying to do is to make the brain and the body essentially coordinate in ways that allow a consistent response to that.
And it's not like a punitive exercise. It's more, my impression of it is that they retain that curiosity.
It's a reach.